A very good morning. Welcome all participants. My name is Dipanjan Chaudhury. I am a senior assistant editor with the Economic Times. I cover foreign and strategic affairs for the Economic Times. Today we are in for a very interesting session, the pandemic in Africa and how the African states are responding to this global pandemic. For this session, we have three prominent speakers. Pramit Chaudhury, who needs no introduction per se. He's a foreign affairs expert who has been covering global affairs for a long time across the continents. We have Ambassador Mahesh Sachdev, who has served twice in Africa as ambassador and also in Norway. And we have Mr. David Rasquinha, who knows the line of credit business like nobody else in this country. He has been with Exim Bank for many, many years. And he has been at the forefront of assisting the African countries to avail the line of credit that our government has announced. So we begin with Mr. Chaudhury. Mr. Chaudhury, how bad or good is the pandemic scene in Africa, and how have the African states across the length and breadth dealt with this crisis?
Well, Africa now has roughly little over 50,000 confirmed cases and 2,000 confirmed deaths. Obviously, compiling the figures, testing in particular, not unlike India, has been particularly difficult in large stretches of Africa. So the story there is really still beginning. We have seen a number of countries, South Africa, for example, impose a very strict lockdown, again, very similar to what we did here, and has been able to bring down, flatten the curve, as they say. Ghana has done an extremely good job in also doing a lockdown and bringing down the curve of the infections. There are other parts of Africa which have struggled because obviously Africa being a continent, there are different capabilities across different countries. The Congo and lots of other places which have suffered civil war or weak governments have struggled. But basically the North African countries have been particularly high number of cases in Egypt, Algeria, and so on. But the story is just beginning, if you wish. And a number of countries have really excelled. Even some of the poorer countries, Liberia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, have done well, partly because they had already built in capacities on the basis of their previous experiences with the Ebola virus epidemics. And have been able to resuscitate those despite relatively minimal resources. But as I said, Africa is arguably the last continent to really get the coronavirus, the COVID-19. So it's still in many ways an early story, and they are facing exactly the same problems everybody else has in terms of maintaining social distancing, establishing getting for example, ventilators and medicines. India has provided them with other countries as much medicine as we can, but it continues to be a continuing issue. The other factor, which we can go into, of course, later, is the fact that Africa's economy is based very strongly on commodities, linked very strongly to commodity prices, which have crashed, oil prices in particular. Nigerian Boston River crude has been selling at $10 to $11 a barrel. Somebody said the barrel is worth more now than the actual oil crude inside it. Angola has a similar issue. South Africa, a more diversified economy, but again, its main products, its main exports, such as coal and rare precious metals, have all seen their prices go into free fall. So Africa faces a major economic stress at the same time that it is now coming to grips with the COVID-19.
Ambassador Sachdev, could you throw some light on the northern part of Africa, the Arab Africa? You have served here, and you also understand the dynamics of the Arab world. So how is it different from the Central, Eastern, and Western Africa, in your opinion?
I think there is a paradigm difference. North Africa, to start with, the worst case scenario is in Libya,
Okay.
where a civil war is going on and nobody has time and energy for pandemics like coronavirus. Uh, even details are not available, how many patients, etc., etc. Egypt has done not so well. Algeria is particularly badly off. It is the second worst performer in entire Africa after South Africa, and the death rate in Algeria is 12%, amongst the highest in Africa and in the world. In other words, 12% of the corona positive cases succumb to death even after treatment. So that is particularly bad. I think the cooperation across the borders has not been very useful. Uh, they are close to Europe, Southern Europe, which has been very badly affected. Spain, France, and Italy. They've had immigrant communities which have been crossing the borders and all that till recently. So that is particularly bad influence. Morocco, the details are not available. Tunisia is not doing particularly well, although it has had strings of lockdowns and is claims to be over the hump. But we might soon see resurgence if the situation in Libya continues to be bad. The immediate sub-Saharan Africa, Mali, Chad, Sudan are potentially badly placed. They're likely to be the next wave of infections.
You have served in Nigeria, and it's the most populous country in Africa and among the most populous country in the world. So how bad is the situation? Because it's not a well-governed country, right? So
Surprisingly, Nigeria seemed to have done better than many. 200 million people, as you said, and it has had only 40 deaths. And the total cases, I think, is 1,000, between 1 and 2,000. The lockdowns in Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, Kanu, etc., have been relaxed, and it's been imposed on the rural areas where they're doing it in phases so that economic activity is not affected. There is some mysterious outbreak in Kanu, the second most populous city in Nigeria in the north, and more than 500 people seem to have died. But there's sparse evidence linking it to coronavirus. I think one reason that Nigeria has done better is what Pramit mentioned about the previous episode with Ebola. And Lagos was where Ebola was stopped at Herculean price. A lot of medical professionals lost their lives, but they saved the city, Africa's biggest city. And this seemed to be the case this time as well so far.
um, Mr. Rasquina, the Exim Bank has a long history in dealing with the African countries, right? You have been involved with these processes. Could you share the current status of the various line of credit and implementation in Africa, and the way forward coming out of this crisis? How do India wants to engage? Because we hear that Indo-African Summit, which has been planned, is on the anvil. So what are our plans for Africa? India's plan for Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Dipanjan. See, you're now faced with a rather paradoxical situation. most of the lines of credit, you're aware that we started this process in 2003. There have been some learning experiences in the initial years. There were some less than savory incidents which happened. There was a certain amount of gaming of the system. But from December 2015, when the guidelines were significantly revised, the situation changed dramatically for the better. You've had top quality Indian companies executing line of credit projects. There has been greater control. And I think all stakeholders, the overseas governments, as well as the government of India and Indian exporters, are a lot more confident about the way things are going. So for this to happen right now is frankly a bit of a body blow. If you look at the status of individual projects, very honestly, most projects are right now at a standstill. You cannot really execute a project, be it an engineering or a construction project, when you're also practicing social distancing. The two just don't go hand in hand together. So while various running account bills have been submitted right up till the end of March and early April, now that is tapering off. So you could have a situation where a lot of remobilization will have to be taking place for various projects of men, of materials, of getting things back together. So there is going to be a bit of a breakdown in the short run. I'm more concerned in the long run, however, because you can always take a short run kind of a hiatus in a project. It happens in the normal course of events also when you don't have right of way, you don't have supply issues, logistics. That's part of a project. Where are we going, however, in the medium to long term? Pramit already spoke about where commodity prices are headed. Now, we have to bear in mind that where Africa is concerned, commodity prices are very, very important. Now, I'm not looking at any individual one. Yes, you had the famous episode where the West Texas futures on the US market went negative for delivery in May. Now, that was a market event. You had a demand supply imbalance. But if you take a look at oil exports in Africa, over 85% of their exports are oil in the case of Libya, Angola, South Sudan, Chad, Algeria, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, which Ambassador just mentioned. In fact, Nigeria and Angola are the region's two top oil exporters, and these are particularly exposed. So on the one hand, you have a slowdown in output because of the OPEC agreement. At the same time, you have a collapse in prices. You also have a collapse in demand because economic activity isn't taking place. Let's not just focus on natural resources from the commodity point of view. Tourism is a huge part of Africa. It's almost 7 to 8% of GDP, of African GDP, is from tourism receipts. Now, this is by way of travel. This is by way of animal tourism. In the case of countries like Tanzania, etc., it is historical tourism in the case of Egypt. But just the estimated air passenger loss is around $4 billion in 2020 compared to 2019. And some of these countries, Seychelles, Cabo Verde, the Gambia, Morocco, Mauritius, very dependent on tourism, Lesotho, Madagascar, Tanzania, Egypt, these are very, very dependent on tourism. And let's not forget remittances. We in India already understand the importance of remittances for our current account deficit. According to the World Bank, sub-Saharan African countries will see a drop in remittances by almost 25%. That's one quarter drop in 2020 in the wake of this particular crisis. Now, Nigeria is again one of the largest recipients of remittance flows. You have Ghana, you have Kenya. South Sudan is a major beneficiary of all this. So all in all, you're going to see a GDP hit of anything from 22 billion right up to 100 billion. Now, this is for a continent whose overall GDP is about 2 trillion US dollars. So you can see the impact. Now, where am I coming on this? I mean, these all numbers are fine. But for any project under a line of credit, you have to have a contribution by the host government. Now, this means domestic revenue has to be applied. You're at a situation where a project is in a hiatus. At the same time, revenue is reducing because of commodity price drops. Expenditure is increasing because of the need to spend on healthcare in these countries. Are the lines of credit projects going to be that much of a priority? We're going to have a case-by-case approach. You also have a situation where the G20 has been informally, there's an informal communique. I mean, the GDP doesn't mandate, it has a communique asking the members to treat debt servicing requirements with a certain amount of sympathy. The president of Nigeria has already gone on record asking for a complete debt forgiveness. Now, that might be at one extreme. Various countries, we all have to work together because you can't have a situation where a few countries engage in debt forgiveness and the others do not, because obviously that means a money transfer to those countries. So all in all, I think we need to have a significant relook at this program in the near term. It's not that things are gone awry. but we probably need to recalibrate our approach.
So, if I understand correctly, so there could be some requests for moratorium of debt or restructuring or seeking delay in payment, right? Seeking like few African countries had done even before the outbreak of COVID. So they might request that request to India for delay in the payment, right?
Very likely. I mean, not just India. The request would go to all global creditors, including
Sure.
multilaterals like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, bilateral aid or concession financing donors, India, China, the USA, just about everybody.
So what how do we then what do we look at the future of infrastructure projects in Africa in such a situation?
Ultimately, infrastructure is essential for Africa. I mean, it's a continent which is
Right,
perhaps about 7 times the size of India, but its
right,
GDP is the same as that of the Indian subcontinent. So that itself
right,
gives you an idea of the infrastructure gap. The total route network of rail kilometers in India is greater than the route network of rail kilometers in all of Africa put together.
okay,
So if you just look at railways as one infrastructure sector, imagine the gap that you have. Now you look at power, you look at roads, you look at industry. So you cannot avoid investment in infrastructure. Africa ultimately is a continent of the future. If you look at population as an indicator of economic growth and as demand for products, you already have a situation where China, Korea, Japan are going negative on population. Europe is going negative on population. Russia is going negative on population. The
right,
US more or less treading ground because of
sure,
immigration. Even in India, where population is still growing, the southern states are already below replacement level. It is a few of the northern states which are keeping the overall population up. So in the next 10 years, in the next decade, it is Africa which is going to be the only continent which will show a consistent increase in population. And with a consistent increase in population comes a consistent increase in demand for goods, for
right,
automobiles, for power, for infrastructure, for consumer goods. That is
right.
going to be the market of the future for the whole world. So all of us have an interest in keeping Africa going.
Mr. Chaudhary, can we, if I divide, the continent into the English-speaking states and the Francophone Africa, there are pockets of Portuguese and Spanish. I'm not getting into this. So, how do you think? Do you think is if I just juxtapose this, who do you think is better positioned to handle this crisis?
Well, I don't think that the language factor really determines which country or which.
I meant the both were under different colonial powers, and both had a different experience to share to these countries. So would it be correct to say that one will be better placed than the other to handle this?
Um, I mean, there's a broad argument, I think, among African scholars and political scientists that those that were governed by the British
Right,
have more stable governance systems. So if you look at South Africa, Nigeria, the East African states, and so on, they have a civil society, they have a
yeah,
civil situation very similar to what we have in India. They have a slightly better record in being democratic and being a stronger civil society. But there are a number of English-speaking countries like Sierra
right,
Leone collapsed into civil war and is still struggling to get out of it. So the record is hardly perfect. On the other hand, for many decades, Côte d'Ivoire, which is French, was considered one of the best managed African nations, Senegal as well, despite being Francophone. And so on. So I don't think it's very clear. But the point is that the Anglophone countries are largely the biggest and the wealthiest of the African countries are Anglophone. Other than Angola, which is Portuguese, the southern parts of Angola actually are English speaking. You have most of the largest and the most well-known African countries, definitely for Indians, are definitely Anglophone. That doesn't matter, I think, as far as India is concerned. As you know, last year, 2 years, we conduct a large number of new embassies in Africa and many African countries. We did not have representation. And the bulk of those countries were Francophone, or at least non-Anglophone nations. So now we have ambassadorial representation, I think, in virtually almost every major African country, irrespective of what language they speak. But the broader issue on as far as the COVID-19 crisis is concerned will be that different parts of Africa, because of their different capacities, and what David has mentioned, the debt issues, and I think this is going to be very important, the capacity to pay off debt. David Malcolm, the World Bank president, did make a public warning, I think, earlier this year, saying that, look, African countries have massively increased their external debt. The continent now has almost $600 billion in external debt. And it's a magnitude higher than what it was even 5 years ago. But the bulk of this is owed to China. It's owed to China and the payment structures and of how these are, the debt, the interest rates, the nature of these debts is almost completely opaque, because the Chinese have never revealed, neither the African government or the Chinese have revealed the details of this. We know that a large number of these African countries, as we mentioned earlier, have asked for debt moratorium. And we also are getting reports, there have been 2 or 3 reports now saying that the Chinese have basically said, especially those projects that are linked to the Belt Road Initiative, will not be eligible for that debt moratorium. And in fact, the Chinese have said, if you can't pay it off, give us assets, give us the railway, give us the port, give us other things in return for the debt that you are unable, the interest payments that you're unable to pay. So what we are moving towards potentially is an enormous, should we say, asset grab by China over the next 10 to 15 years in Africa, as the combination of a collapse in economic capacities, whether it's because of commodities, tourism, aviation. Ethiopian Airlines, easily one of the most successful airlines in the developing world, has warned its government that it may have to close, or it's in danger of bankruptcy if it does not get support. All of these sectors are in danger. Africa's capacity to pay off the debt is now minimal, but it has its biggest creditor is saying, I'm giving you no forgiveness, but I want to have physical, tangible assets in Africa handed over to me. So this is something both strategically and economically is something India may have to watch out for, in the sense that while we can't possibly pay that off, we could potentially be working with other countries in trying to figure out how to soften this blow, if you wish. The Americans have put together this Blue Dot network. We have been trying to work with the Japanese in working in joint projects in Africa. That may have to be expanded as an attempt to help the Africans maintain a degree of fiscal or financial autonomy in the next decade or 2.
Yes, Mr. Rasquinha.
Yeah, thanks, Dipanjan. I just wanted to take off from what Pramit just mentioned. The debt is definitely a big worry, but even more of concern, and I think Pramit alluded to that, is what is the size of the problem? We don't really know. We know the size of the multilateral debt that Africa has. We know the size of the bilateral debt between, let's say, Europe, America, Japan, Korea, and Africa. The Indian lines of assistance are completely disclosed on our website. But when you're looking at what is the assistance from China, there is a complete lack of information. What is the quantum? What is the terms? How much of it to which country? You're looking literally at an opaque system. And unless you know what is the size of the problem, how do you find a solution? That is something which is a really big worry for all of us.
How do you see, how do you see the China-Africa relations shaping up in the foreseeable future? The requests for writing off loans, and which China is of course not willing to undertake. How is it going to impact the relations?
That is a challenge which China is going to have to deal with right now, because I think by rule of thumb or by anecdotal evidence, China is very clearly the largest creditor to most of the African countries.
Sure.
Therefore, any move on debt relief, and I think it's axiomatic that some amount of debt relief is required. You can argue about what is the quantum and what is the mechanics, but debt relief is something which is going to be necessary. Now, if you're going to have some form of debt relief, whatever the form, then the largest creditor has to be there and the largest creditor has to take the lead, which means China has to be willing. And as Pramit pointed out, they have very clearly gone on record saying that BRI loans are not to be covered by any form of debt relief. They are purely commercial. They have a kind of a mutual benefit to both countries. I mean, this is the Chinese assertion. I'm not necessarily agreeing with them. And therefore, that will not be covered by debt relief. So this is definitely going to impact relationships, because ultimately, if you are an African country looking for debt relief, you want your largest creditor to take the lead on this matter and take things further from there. So I think this is going to present an interesting challenge for China. It's the old story. If you owe your banker $100, you have a problem. But if you owe your banker $5 billion, your banker has your problem. And in this case, China is the banker.
Yeah, Ambassador Sachdev, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I have few figures. Of course, China's debt to Africa is a bit vague, but China Africa Study Center at Johns Hopkins University has tried to put a figure, and the figure is $138 billion, which makes them biggest debtor to Africa. Secondly, G20 finance ministers have collectively agreed for a moratorium for a limited period, in principle, to all least developed countries and some other special cases. This was last month. So that, in response to that, China has said that such moratoria or write-off has to be discussed case to case with individual countries, and they're not willing to go along with G20's prescript. Thirdly, the IMF, in its last report on the 15th of last month on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has reduced the rate of growth from 3.6% projected last October for sub-Saharan Africa to minus 1.6% now. And this is subject to further deterioration. So sub-Saharan Africa collectively is likely to grow by minus 1.6%, which is unprecedented in Africa's history since decolonization. And the rate of growth, when divided in terms of main economic activity, as has already been mentioned, for tourism-dependent countries is the highest, minus 6.1%. Oil exporters like Nigeria are to suffer 3.4% decline in their GDP during this year. Non-oil but commodity exporters like South Africa are to go down by 5.1%. So situation is quite dire. Thank you.
For all viewers, we will open up the Q&A session from 12:10. It's almost 12 now. Mr. Chaudhary, you want to add something? You referred to the multilateral approach for the cooperation in the African continent. In India, we have seen India approaching it in a bilateral basis so far, with India, UAE in Ethiopia, India, Japan in Kenya, and some talks with Saudi, very initial talks, and with France. So how do you see I see a great future for this. How can this be planned? And has there been any discussion on this among the stakeholders?
Are you referring to me or?
No, to Pramit.
Oh, sorry. Okay. No, it's fine. I mean, as far as I know, there has been nothing other than what the G20 has announced. A cluster of these multilateral financial institutions, World Bank, Africa Development Bank, had collectively announced, I believe, about a $50 to $60 billion emergency fund for Africa. But clearly that's not going to be enough. This is just an immediate response. So you're going to probably see further multilateral aid projects or finance being put up. The European Union has already announced I think a $500 billion credit facility, not just for Africa, but for other countries, but presumably Africa will be one of the largest recipients. This is all fine, and I think we'll see that there is a lot of capital in the world right now. Central banks are printing money, and you saw that the G20 leaders announced pledge of $5 trillion in extra liquidity. So some of that will be definitely coming to Africa, but ultimately a lot of this will be debt. So it will add to Africa's debt issues, and will have to be paid off at some point. I mean, some of it will be written off, but a lot of it will not. But your bigger problem is that you're looking at a commodity price depression that probably will last for quite a few years. And certain products, notably oil, which as David mentioned is Africa's single largest export, may never recover beyond $20 to $30 a barrel. There's simply too much oil in the world. A lot of the African producers are expensive producers, so they will be priced out of the market if they fight against a Saudi Arabia or a Kuwait or United Arab Emirates. So this is going to be a major long-term economic issue for Africa as a whole. And I think one of the things to keep in mind will be, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops, is that you saw with the IMF support for Pakistan, when they had financial difficulties caused by the BRI, America came in and objected and said, we are not giving money to the IMF to give to Pakistan to hand over to China. If that's the sequence of events in which American money is then just used to bail out a Chinese bank, in the end, then we're not involved. And we're not going to allow that money through. The problem is that is going to be a very similar story for a lot of African countries, especially given the opacity of their agreement with China. And this is going to be an issue, I suspect, that we'll see given the very sharp deterioration in relations between US and China. At the very least, there will be a demand that if you're going to take money from us, you are going to have to tell us what your agreement with China is. You have to tell us what those documents show and what exactly is going to be happening to the money we give you. So you're going to see a lot of this internal battle. It's going to be much more difficult, messy, multilateral financial aid structure because of this geopolitical mix. The second thing I think we should emphasize, and it's important, there's an assumption, I think, a lot of people that, oh, Africa, it's poor, it's a messy place, it's just going to get worse, let's not deal with this at all. And it's important to realize that Africa, as I mentioned, it's a continent, it's not a country, and there are large chunks of Africa that are doing perfectly well. We saw The Economist magazine recently had a 66th nation emerging economies ranking. The number one emerging economy in terms of its financial stability and strength was an African country, Botswana. Nigeria was number 14, ranked better than India, which was number 18. So it's not as if there are not large chunks of Africa that are still worth investing in. And in fact, given their present financial condition, would actually be a great place to put your money in and invest, because assets will be cheaper, governments will be more welcoming to investment, and they still have resources and finance to be able to provide a beneficial system or profits to a company that wants to invest in there. And second, I think we also keep in mind that Africa is still a continent full of resources which India needs. So if this is an opportunity, while we often overly focus on the Persian Gulf, if you look at the figures, the fact is that at certain times, in the past 3 or 4 years. Nigeria has been our #1 oil supplier. Angola is a country that has begun under new government to consider privatizing its oil company. It is going to carry out large reforms and explicitly said that we want to move away from our over-dependence on oil. So this is another country that would be perfectly placed for us to move into, given what it has and what its interests are. So there are in Africa a large number of different parts of the area of the continent, different sects of economies and sectors which are doing very well or can potentially be extremely worthwhile investing in. And finally, it's important to realize, I emphasize this, technology has been an increasing part of the African economic story. Countries like not just Rwanda, but even in Nigeria, the financial sector was actually growing and contributing more to the economy, or as much to the economy as the oil sector was. And places like Rwanda and East Africa, and Kenya, Ethiopia, you've seen technology and startups and all of that coming out in a remarkable pace. And this is the kind of perfect low capital, high tech, high return in the sector which Indian companies and India as a whole should be looking at partnering with.
We are getting a few questions. Maybe I'll club them because some of them are similar, and depending on your comfort level, you can pick it up. Amit Joshi, he has a question on what will be the future of Chinese investments in Africa. Can India capitalize on the anti-Chinese narrative vis-a-vis the COVID? And there are similar questions. The Dishali Patil, she is asking about, while US and Europe are badly affected and China doesn't seem to offer great help, how can India help Africa to deal with the post-pandemic effects? These were two similar questions. I clubbed it, who want to take it up? So. Yes, Ambassador.
I think it's futile to talk about one country against another in Africa context. Africa needs all, and Africa's requirements are enormous. So as the largest supplier of pharmaceuticals to Africa, we do have a role in this pandemic. Our medicines, particularly anti-malarials, right, which are being used, are useful. Our whatever experience we have gained by keeping COVID cases low is something that is relevant. We, being a tropical country like most of Africa, have that kind of relevance as well. And I think our healthcare has acquitted reasonably well. We are the largest source of medical tourism to Africa. And all these factors put together makes us an indispensable partner for much of African countries as they come out of COVID cases. Now, in terms of what strategy should we have for general economic resuscitation of Africa after COVID, I think I would like to emphasize what Pramit had already mentioned very briefly, the services sector and institution building. I think Africa can do with those kind of assistance in much bigger manner, in a force multiplier way. The clusters, the service-related technology transfer in education, healthcare, management, having small-scale industries is something unique to us. Training of trainers is, again, something that Africa badly needs. Standards being set for various industries, various services is something that is required. We do have appropriate technology for this, which has been proven in hardy space that India has been through past 60 years, and these experiences need to be shared with our African partners.
We have a question, Mr. Rasquinha could take it up. What is the opportunity of cooperation between India and Africa in the agriculture sector in the post-COVID period?
That's an interesting question because, this is something which is going to be a threat for Africa going forward. All of us have been talking about losses in export earnings and breakdowns in supply chain. But if you read what the United Nations World Food Program has been saying, they've been pointing out that the world could face severe famines as a result of conditions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the major worries are countries across Africa, because the shutdown is exacerbating local poverty, it is preventing agricultural activity. So you might have the economic impact of the virus being much greater than the virus. And the World Food Program has specifically listed 10 countries at risk, including within Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, and South Sudan. Now, this is definitely a huge worry. So we do need to work with the countries in Africa to see how we can support the agricultural sector. Already under the Lines of Credit program, we've had efforts at helping various African countries in improving the productivity of rice, maize, cassava, processing of tomato into tomato paste, etc. Several parts of Senegal, for example, which were dependent on imports of rice, are now self-sufficient. One of my favorite examples, if you visit Uganda, which is a lovely country in Africa, you will find that the pineapples in Uganda are probably the best in the world.
Yes.
Large, juicy, sweet, you name it. Yet you have zero investment from companies like Dole and Del Monte, which are the big guys in pineapple. And there's a very interesting reason why. The Ugandan pineapples are so large that they don't fit the machines. The typical can of pineapple has that small round diameter. The Ugandan pineapple is too big for that, so there's too much of wastage. Now, this is a bizarre kind of a situation where an excellent product cannot be done. But now the money comes from pineapple rings, right? So, but things like pineapple chunks or preserved pineapple or pineapple juice can also make up. You may not get as much of margin as you would from pineapple rings, but you will get it from other side products of pineapple. Now, this is where Indian companies need to invest into Africa. Unfortunately, many of us in India have had a project mentality. We want to go, we want to set up a project, a power plant, a road, a railway, you name it, and then we leave and we come away. So we do a good job, no doubt about it. We involve the local population, unlike what China does. But at the same time, this is a transaction mentality. You cannot do business over a long term, and you cannot have relations with the country over a long term on a transaction mentality. You have to have investment. This is where the Indian private sector and maybe the public sector also needs to take a lead. I pointed out earlier, I don't want to repeat my argument about Africa being the market of the future. If you accept my logic that Africa is going to be the market of the future, then what are we doing except if we are not investing there? We have Indian private sector which has invested in South Africa, for example, concrete sleepers, liquid glass sodium silicate for detergent manufacture, processing of coffee, of cocoa, of shea nuts, textile factories. We need to see a lot more Indian investment. You cannot have a situation where you're going to be exporting from India to Africa forever. You have to have some of the activity moving to Africa. And this investment is what will make the long-term economic relationship. I know the question started with agriculture, but I'm taking it on a wider level from investment also.
Uh, there is a follow up to this. It's a question to you, Mr. Rasquinha, that as per your judgment, which of the African countries are politically and economically?
Sorry, your question broke off, Dipanjan? Yeah, I could read the question. I couldn't get your voice clearly.
Yeah.
I don't.
As per your
Yeah.
judgment, which of the African countries? Yeah.
I think they're huge. I think Pramit answered that question already and did a great job of it. You know, we have this mistaken impression of looking at Africa as one monolith. It's not. It's about 54 different countries, and several of those countries, when it comes to ease of doing business, when it comes to attractiveness of investment, rank higher than India. You know, we need to open our eyes to this fact and stop getting misled by just a few negative incidents or a few negative media reports, and realize that there is a huge investment opportunity waiting for us. But I would like to look even further beyond that. You know, what I would like to see India and Africa engaging in is institutional development. If I take the Indian example, Indian industry today, manufacturing, you name it, you name the biggest names, the Tatas, the Birlas, the Ambanis, whoever they may be. They came up because of the development financial institutions set up by the government of India from the 1960s onwards. You had the IFCI, the IDBI, the ICICI, the entire alphabet soup. These were able to channelize savings from less productive users to investment in industry. They were able to give long-term financing, 12 years, 15 years, which would enable industry to build up. I'm going on record that if any industrialist today in India is doing well, he should be thanking the IDBI, the ICICI, the IFCI, and others. Now, where are the similar IDBIs and IFCIs and ICICIs of Africa? You have the regional development banks who are doing a good job, but they are small, let's face it. The African Development Bank has done a fantastic job. It's the largest lender in Africa, but the needs of the African continent are so huge that even the AFDB cannot do that. I would love to have a situation where India works with different parts of the continent, sets up these kind of institutions, development banks. Let's take an equity stake. We have the expertise, we have the hard-learned lessons of several decades to share with them, and that will channelize domestic savings. You cannot develop Africa only on the basis of external finance coming in. You need to muster domestic savings and channelize them into investment. This is where investment would make a difference. Now, this means also institutional development. At Exim Bank of India, we have worked to set up Exim Banks in Ghana. We have worked to set up an export development program in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in other countries. We're working with the ITC in Geneva on the CETA program, the Supporting Indian Trade Preferences for Africa, to build up capability to export out of there. It has to be a partnership approach. And I would love to see us doing more of institutional development. Let the Chinas of the world engage in the infrastructure projects and all. That doesn't mean we don't. We do that. But we also focus on institutions, because when everybody has forgotten the project, the institution will remain.
Mr. Sachdev, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I think with regard to food processing industries, I think the point has already been made about pineapples of Uganda. There are similar and closer at home issues, such as palm oil. We are the biggest importer of palm oil in the world. And palm oil originated in West Africa. Malaysians and Indonesians took palm oil seedlings from that part of the world to their own countries, and now have become fairly big. Now, we import no palm oil from West Africa because West African palm oil is not processed to the international standard, I mean. So if Amul kind of mechanism of collecting palm oil periodically, processing it or semi-processing it in Nigeria, for example, and then exporting it to India, could be worked, it'll have huge spin-offs for local economies and for our foreign exchange earnings, because we pay usurious rates very often, which get politicized because of Indonesia and in Malaysian proclivities and so on. So those are the kind of things. Cotton, for example, is another. There are many others. Hides and skins. We are among the biggest leather producers in the world, and we import hides and skins from all over the world. Central Africa has the huge store of hides and skins which are available for local processing. We could take that up as well. So there are nuggets to be picked in food processing, agricultural processing industries all over Africa. Thank you.
Um, um, Ambassador Anil Wad, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa has an interesting question. He asks, in the context of the Indo-African economic relations, should India, in the new situation and taking into account forthcoming India-Africa summit, set aside funds for Indian industry to invest in Africa rather than lending to African countries at concessional rates or giving grants for development projects? I think Mr. Rasquinha has answered it partly, but I think you can elaborate on that. Yeah.
Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you for saying that. I think that's a brilliant idea. It's something which we've been saying for some time. You know, like you have the India Brand Equity Fund, we need to create a fund for Africa. Now, I accept the point, for example, India is a capital scarce country, but this, and I think Pramit made that point earlier, this is where Indo-Japan collaboration could come in perfectly. Japan, in fact, looks to India to lead the way into Africa because we are more familiar with Africa, we are better accepted in Africa, we are already on the ground in Africa in terms of the offices of Indian companies, offices of the Exim Bank of India, actual Indian community in Africa, we are well established. You have a perfect marriage. You have India, which is capital scarce, Japan, which is capital surplus, India, which has a high cost of capital, Japan, whose cost of capital sometimes is almost negative. You have a high population and high labor in India with a low cost of labor, and the exact opposite in Japan. It's a marriage made in heaven. If we can work together with Japan, create a fund for this kind of investment by, not just India, obviously it has to benefit Japan also. Let's have Indo-Japanese joint ventures in Africa. And the best example is, you're probably tired of hearing me saying this, what happened with Maruti Udyog. In 1984, when Suzuki invested in India, there were a lot of jokes. Suzuki at that point of time was doing very well. They and Daihatsu were the small car manufacturers of Japan. And there was a lot of laughter because the initial capacity of the Maruti plant in Gurgaon, I think it was about 10,000 cars per annum or something like that, which was a drop in the bucket. Today, the Suzuki India is the biggest contributor of sales and profits to the entire Suzuki of the world. Why can't we replicate that in Japan? Because Suzuki didn't just create a car plant. It created an ecosystem of automobile parts, seats, horns, electric wiring, sheet metal, engine assembly, the works. It created an entire industrial system. It created a quality mentality. We accepted the quality norms of the Japanese and created an entirely new industry from scratch. Why can't we work with Japan to do a similar project in Africa? We can talk to various countries. I'm sure many of them would welcome this kind of a setup, and we would need to have cooperation because whichever country the plant or the ecosystem is set up in, it would have to cater to the regional market. The national market will not be enough. So under the African Free Trade Arrangement, this plant can then cater to all of Africa. This is a win-win situation for Japan and for India. And if this can work on a pilot, we can open it up to so many other industries.
I have a question for Mr. Chaudhury. This is from Bipul Chatterjee, the Executive Director of CUTS. He asks, do you think that India will be willing to lead a coalition of middle powers to devise a middle path between the US and China for a shared prosperity in the post-COVID world order?
Is this specifically for Africa or just generally for the
I think it's general, but I think it's because you had referred to this in the context of Africa a bit, you know.
Well, the question, let's put it this way. I foresee that on a number of issues, you will have to create new coalitions of the willing. These coalitions will not be completely the same. You cannot have this. You cannot have a 5G technology coalition led by India. I don't think India could lead it because we're not a leader in that technology, but we're a big market for it. In which we have several countries, possibly including China, but otherwise maybe including US, Japan, South Korea. But that same coalition would not necessarily be the same coalition you want to have for global vaccine technology. It would not necessarily be a different coalition for development in Africa. You can include China in some of them, exclude China in others, and so on. It's no longer a question of a clear Manichaean binary divide in all of these issues. So the real question you have to do over if you are going to build coalitions and work with coalitions like this, is to assemble a set of countries which more or less fulfill your interests or aligned with your, or you believe are aligned with your interests. But to recognize that these coalitions will be different in every single segment that you're talking about. They could even be different in different regions of the world. That is going to be the challenge. And part of the challenge will be that different countries themselves are changing, and certain things like technology, different countries pop up suddenly and say, actually, we're pretty good at this, better than you had expected. We have to incorporate them in. So yes, coalitions, can we lead them? Some of them, yes, partly because we are politically more acceptable, I think, than a lot of other middle powers are. Others, however, for example, in technology, we are lacking certain capacities. So we can at best take a political initiative, not accept that we will have to take a second backseat in terms of actually providing the technical assistance. In finance, we also have limitations. But again, it's an ability to provide certain elements to that coalition. And I think the strength we have is in the political and diplomatic side. Obviously, military coalition is another area we'll be very strong in, but those tend to be extremely sensitive. But let's say anti-piracy. We thought international coalition more or less stopped the piracy in Somalia, off the coast of Somalia. But piracy has erupted in the Gulf of Guinea. It's now a major issue for countries like Algeria and Cameroon. They don't have very strong naval capacities. And it's an area you may remember during the Ananta Aspen ambassador lecture, the Nigerian ambassador actually said, we would welcome the Indian Navy coming to help us in this area. This is something, an anti-piracy coalition working off the coast of Africa. We can bring in the Americans. They still have the world's most powerful Navy, at least in that part of the world, and bring in the Chinese. This is not a political, this is not an ideological issue, fighting pirates. And that's a kind of area we could also be potentially a leader.
We are coming to the fag end of our discussion, this fascinating, discussion. There are a couple of questions on terror and North Africa, and I'm going to club them for Ambassador Sachdev. Somebody had asked about, one of our participants had asked about the prospects for Indian businesses in Egypt in the post-COVID situation. Prime Minister was planning to visit Egypt if there was no COVID on his way to EU. So probably there is a queue there. And what are the how is the terrorism? There's another question from one of the participants. How is the terrorism scenario going to pan out in the post-COVID in the Western Sahel?
In
the West Sahel. Yeah.
Western Africa.
Western Africa, the Sahel, yeah.
Yeah, West Sahel.
So I just combine this two for you because this will be in the in your domain of
yes, we do have 2 or 3 minutes, so
yeah, 3
I'll
minutes,
be quick.
Yeah. Sure.
I think Egypt is faced with serious terrorist situation with the ISIS resurgence in Sinai Peninsula. Although there have been some odd instances of terrorism in Cairo and other major cities along the Nile, but the situation there seems to be under control. And I think in general, the threat of terrorism in Egypt mainland seem to have petered off. Unless there are some new development in post-COVID world and Egyptian suffer further tourism related losses, I think the situation should be, economic social situation should be under control. There could also be blowback from Libya, which is a neighboring country. If GNA troops are able to decisively defeat Haftar's forces, then there might be consequences on the on Egyptian western side in Egypt. In terms of West African sub-Sahel region, we have emergence of serious threat once again in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and Niger, and Boko Haram threat never went away. But with ISIS taking advantage of coronavirus-related preoccupations of the local governments, uh, we do see instances almost every week in this part of the world. And I'm afraid the situation could get worse because, as we have already discussed through this uh, 1 hour long discourse, we have weak governments and we have they being preoccupied with economic management and getting coronavirus under control. Thank you.
We have almost come to the end of this fascinating discussion organized by Ananta Aspen. I would invite all the three prominent speakers for their closing remarks. Mr. Rasquinha, how do you see the way forward in the Indo-African cooperation in the post-COVID world order?
As I always say, you never have a problem without an opportunity. And I would look at this as an opportunity, a learning opportunity to avoid the mistakes that we've made in the past, and more importantly, to refocus on what we should be doing. I would strongly look at institutional building. I would strongly look at investment and give a slightly lesser importance to pure transactions.
Thank you. And Mr. Sachdev?
I think I would reiterate importance that we could give to services sector, and I think being perhaps an outlier, I am not such a great fan of multilateralism. I think bilateral approach with individual African countries pays better dividend than going through African Union or African Commission, which has its own agenda. Thank you.
Mr. Chaudhury, what are your thoughts? And I would like to add one question which came from a participant and couldn't be. Is it about the defense cooperation between India and Africa, taking forward of the DEF Expo, the participation of the DEF Expo by the defense ministers from Africa?
Well, on the defense cooperation, and I'll just say that the military security element is another element of which India's cooperation with Africa is slowly starting to build up. We saw at the last Indo-Africa summit, the Prime Minister signed, if I remember correctly, 13 bilateral defense agreements with African countries. We've provided funding to the Malian army in its battle with ISIS and so on. We've always had a very strong defense relationship with certain countries, notably Mozambique, where we're going back to the region that was a frontline state against South Africa. We are now, as you know, we have a major push on the export of weapons. We're now building enough things like artillery, patrol boats, so we can actually now export some of those weapons to other countries. Mauritius is one of our first clients, and that is something we can continue to move from. In the littoral region of the Indian Ocean, these states that run across the Indian Ocean, we need to develop and are developing much closer naval cooperation, because this is an area we are concerned about, not only because of the recession of American power as America pulls out its warships from the Indian Ocean region, but the fact, of course, that China is slowly moving into that empty space, and we need to be there, preferably before they come. Broadly speaking, on just my closing comments, is that as what we've all mentioned here, I think, is that the African relationship that India needs now is to look beyond just a simple issue of buying and selling oil, gold, and a few other elements, and so on. It needs to be moving into a whole host of. It has to be moving into, as David has mentioned, the concept of institution building. I should also add the Election Institute of India helps African countries run and manage their elections. We have a defense one. We need to be working into the finance and the technology side. Indian companies need to be encouraged to look into this area, that Africa is also a tech and finance and service center. We need to be looking at a more, should we say, a holistic approach in which it's not just government, but it is a number of other elements of Indian society all working together, or at least working at different levels, because that's, as Africa is the future, but it is also a very big future, and we need to be able to handle, approach it at a number of different ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chaudhuri. Thank you, Mr. Sachdev. Thank you, Mr. Rasquinha, for enlightening the audience. It has been a fascinating 1 hour. We could go on, with each 54 countries for 54 days, if not more. It has been a learning experience for me. Ananta Aspen uh, Center brings such, topics to the table, which really fascinates the audience world over. It's part of the series on the COVID pandemic, on various aspects, as we navigate this pandemic and the prepare for the war. And the center hopes to bring many more such webinars in the coming days on various international aspects, economic aspects, and other socio-economic aspects in the coming days. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.